Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining government and politics. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first, we're going to define the concept government. Then, we're going to take a look at different forms of government. When it comes to the different forms of government, we basically ask ourselves two questions. One is we ask the question of who's doing the governing, because who's doing the governing tells us about what type of government that you have. And then another aspect of government that helps with the definition is to know how much control or power does the government have, because the more power that the government has over the people defines the type of government it is. And then we're going to look at the difference between government and politics. So we'll spend some time defining the concept of politics, since this is a class on both government and politics. And then we're going to talk about the differences between government and politics. So that's what we've got on the docket. Let's go ahead and get started. So your textbook offers a very sort of simple, but I think comprehensive definition of government. And so your textbook defines on page 5 that government is the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. I like that definition because it's very broad. It's not telling us that government has to have so many institutions or specific procedures. Governments rule over any kind of, institutions that govern over any sort of territory and people, fall into that definition of government. And so as you're going to see in chapter 1, that governments can be very small, they can be very large. Like the United States government is huge. They have very specific procedures. Others have informal procedures. And the number of people that are ruled over can be vast or it can be quite small. And so that definition that's offered in the textbook, I think, is a good one because it incorporates or encompasses many different types of government. Now, when we get to the second unit in this class, that is when we're going to dig into learning about the actual institutions and procedures of American government. It's where you're going to learn about Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, about the presidency and the executive branch, and also the federal judiciary. Okay? And so this is a class that's dedicated to learning about federal government, but states have governments, cities have governments, counties have governments as well. Now, regardless of how large or small a government is, or how many people it rules over, or the territory, the size of its territory, governments share specific functions, okay? When you sort of think about the impact that government has on your life, and they have that nice sort of chart in the textbook that shows how much impact government has on our lives, you're going to see that, government basically controls your behavior. When you were driving to school, it was telling you how fast you are going to work, how fast you can go. There are consequences if you go over the speed limit. It divvies up resources. So like if you live in the West, or just recently, Waukesha is beginning to get Lake Michigan water is being diverted over to Waukesha, and so the government has something to do with that divvying up of the resource, in this case, water. Benefits are conferred. Government confers benefits, okay? And so as a student paying tuition, it could very well be that you are getting federal financial aid, which is a type of benefit that students are can avail themselves to, that others who are not, seeking an education are not, those loans are not available to them. When we think about the specific functions of the government, they generally fall into three broad categories. One is the legislative function, and I'll just put these up here individually. The other is the executive function, and then the third is the judicial function, okay? And so all governments, they make decisions, and that is what the legislative function is. And so they basically make decisions about what kind of actions are prohibited. They make decisions about what kind of benefits people are going to get. They make decisions about what a minimum wage would be. They make decisions about whether we're going to have paid family leave. And then once those decisions are made, that legislative function then those decisions need to be put into action. You can make a government can make as many decisions as it wants, but if it actually doesn't implement those decisions are pretty much meaningless. And so the executive function is taking those decisions and putting them into action, actually like executing them, making sure that people are aware of what the laws are and then following the laws. And then the judicial function, the settling of disputes. And sometimes controversies arise over whether or not the decisions that governments make are in fact legal and constitutional. Sometimes the way in which those decisions are put into action, there's questions sometimes about the constitutionality of those executive actions. And so the judiciary is there to basically define what the law is, to help to give insight into that legislative function, but also to decide and settle disputes that arise over these powers of government. So here are some visual representations of government, government in action, I guess. And so, as I mentioned, governments can be very small or they can be very large. They can govern over small groups of people, small territories, and very large as well. And so here in the upper left hand, we have the Karuk Tribal Council. The Karuk Tribal Council is a council, a governmental council that rules over the tribal members of the Karuk tribe. Down here is the Waukesha City Council, one of the parts of the Waukesha government that presides over the territory of Waukesha. Of course, they have a mayor, which is a part of the executive branch, and police forces, and even courts as well, that assist, that are a part of that government as well. But not all governments have to have three branches of government. We'll be talking about that later in the semester. Got the U.S. House of Representatives here, which is an example of a legislative branch and a part of that three branches of government. And up here we have Saudi Arabia Council of Ministers. And so this is a council of religious leaders that presides over the country of Saudi Arabia. And their main goal is to assist the king with the performance of the king's duty. And so here, you don't have different branches of government necessarily. I mean, you have a monarch who is in control of most of the decision making. But these are good representations of government in action. All right, so we have the basic definition of government down. Now let's take a look at the different types or forms of government. And so, as I noted before, one way we sort of have an idea of what type of government is by finding out who's doing the governing. The other way that we talk about types of governments and put governments into certain sort of categories is by asking the question, how much control or power does the government have over its people? So let's turn our sights to that. Now, as you were reading about different forms of government in your textbook, you probably noticed sort of a common suffix with the words that refer to different types of governments. And that suffix that you see is what's in the green there, the crassy, okay? And so you might be asking yourself, well, what's that telling us? What's that crassy telling us? Well, what crassy is telling us is that it's telling us that it's some sort of rule, okay? It's blank rule, okay? And so crassy is derived from the Greek word to rule, or who has the power, okay? And so in a democracy, as we'll see in a moment, and as you know from doing the reading of the textbook, a demos refers to the people or the masses, right? But we think about it as demos as the people. And so there we're saying that it's the people who's doing the governing. And so keep that Greek suffix in mind as we turn our sights to the different types of government that revolve around who's doing the governing. And so in your textbook, they talk about one type of government is called an autocracy, okay? And autocracy refers to so you have, and let me put the magic pen here, okay? Here you have the word auto, okay? And auto isn't like rule of the automobiles, but auto means self, okay? Or alone. And so when we look at the word autocracy, what it is referring to is it is referring to, whoops, got to take the magic pencil off, a one person who is ruling alone. Okay, and so that's what an autocracy is. And there are many different types of autocracies. There are monarchies, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a good example of an autocracy because they actually have the king. He is the one who does the ruling over, has the ultimate authority over the decisions in that country. And so, but you can also have a dictator, an individual who takes power and rules alone through force. Okay. And so when we're referring to an autocracy, we're referring to the one person who has the power, one person who's doing the ruling. Okay. Autocracies often can refer to like one party that's doing the ruling as well. So an autocracy like Russia falls in the category of an autocracy because at the end of the day, Putin is the one who's really making all the decisions. Okay. In China as well, it's an autocracy because one person, but really like the party who is doing the ruling. But right now, Xi is the one who's in command in China. So it's an autocracy. Now, oligarchy is, again, here we have the green archy. Oligarchy refers to rule of the few because oligos comes from the Greek. That's refers to the few. Okay. And so an oligarchy is where you have a small and privileged group of people. They're often corrupt, that are making the decisions for that territory. And why it's often seen as being corrupt is because that group of the few is making decisions that don't benefit the whole, but is making decisions that benefit that specific group that is doing the ruling. So oligarchy is oftentimes sort of seen as a corrupt form of government. Now, Aristotle saw benefits in all kinds of, saw that if you had a wise and beneficent king, there could be good ruling. Aristotle and Plato both talk about the aristocracy. And so the aristocracy is rule of the few. For Plato, it was the rule of the philosopher kings who are governed by virtue and justice. And so they're able to make really good decisions that benefit the group because they are governed by the principles of justice and virtue. But for the most part in contemporary society, we think about oligarchy as being, probably not a great form of government. Now, in the United States, some have said, well, we have rule of the few, and the rule, even though we call ourselves a democracy, really are more of an oligarchy. And in fact, more specifically, that we are a plutocracy. A plutocracy is what you have the wealthy who are ruling. And so those who have the most financial power, they're the ones who are either in government or influencing government, and they're making, decisions that benefit the wealthy, right? Tax cuts, for example, if you subscribe to thinking about the United States as a plutocracy, tax cuts for the wealthy, which basically leads to underfunding of poverty alleviation programs for those who are in need. Okay. Theocracy, Theo, okay. What could be rule of the poodles? My dog's name is Theo, but theocracy is rule of the clerics, rule of the religious leaders. So if you study theology, you're studying religion. Theocracy is the rule of religious leaders. And Iran is a good example of a theocracy. Saudi Arabia is a good example of a theocracy as well. And then democracy, okay. Demos derived from the people. A democracy is rule of the people. And so this is one way that we think about and define government. We think about it in terms of who is doing the governing. Okay, so another way that we can categorize or think about different forms of government is asking the question, how much power does that government have over its people? Another way of thinking about that are there limits that are placed on the power of government? Your textbook talks about three main categories, going from the governments that have like very few limits, if any at all, on their power, to those that have very specific limits. And so totalitarian governments are the type of governments that have almost unlimited power. Authoritarian governments have unlimited power, but they don't always use their unlimited power. And constitutional governments are the type of governments that have pretty strict limits on their powers. So let's dig into each of these in more detail. So a totalitarian government is called a totalitarian government. It's labeled in that way because it basically has total control over its people, okay? And so a totalitarian government really recognizes little to no limits on its authority. If the government wants to do it, it will do it. And it presides over, it exercises its authority and power in ways that are beyond just like passing laws, right? Or executing laws in a way that, violates human rights and civil liberties. Totalitarian governments really, kind of try to control all aspects of people's lives. The number of children that they can have, the music that they listen to, right? Even how they dress, right? Is really this total takeover of people's lives, complete domination of all aspects of lives. There was a really rise of totalitarianism in the middle part of the 20th century. But we still have some totalitarian governments. But some historic examples are, of course, the Third Reich under the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler, totalitarian, right? Complete and utter control over people's lives and recognize no limits on their authority. China under Mao Zedong from 1949 to 1975. That is a good example of a totalitarian government. People were told how to dress. There was the Cultural Revolution in China, where people who were professionals and lived in cities were mandated, forced to go and work in the countryside to know what it was like to be a proletariat worker. In North Korea, under the Kim dynasty, including Kim Jong-un now, those are sort of a modern day, North Korea is a modern day example of a totalitarian government. Now, an authoritarian government is similar to a totalitarian government in that it technically has no limits on its power. However, an authoritarian government is basically sort of decides who it wants to exercise power over. It focuses control on certain key aspects of that society, and the power is exercised on entities, groups that are really threatening the government directly. And so if you're not really threatening the power of the government may look the other way. But it could be that political parties are allowed. However, once a political party is actually starting to threaten the power of the governing party, then that's it. They'll shut that down. You see that in Iran, the authoritarian government, that when women were forced to wear the hijab and they protested against it, there was a massive crackdowns in Iran, right? And so oftentimes they sort of looked the other way when those rules were broken, but there comes a point where they felt like their power was jeopardized, so they cracked down. 21st century China under Xi Jinping, that's an example of an authoritarian government. Same with Russia, Vladimir Putin in Russia, both examples of modern day authoritarian governments. A constitutional government is different in that that the power is formally limited by a constitution. And so constitutional government there are severe limits that are placed on the power of government. The United States is a constitutional form of government. And so let's dig into what constitutes a constitutional democracy now. Okay, so what form of government is government in the United States government? Well, as it says there, the United States government is known as a constitutional democracy. In other words, it's a democracy because it is ultimately the people who are doing the ruling, but it's also a constitutional democracy because we have a constitution that clearly outlines the type of power that the government has, where the government cannot exercise that kind of power, and then also, that there's a consequence for violating the constitutional order. Okay, so the United States is a constitutional democracy. It's a democracy because we have rule of the people. And when we talk about rule of the people, we think about this concept that your textbook talks about called popular sovereignty. What popular sovereignty is that it's saying that the people are sovereign, right? In other words, the people are the ones that have the ultimate political authority, okay? The ultimate political authority doesn't rest in a king. It doesn't rest in the hands of a few wealthy people. That in the United States, the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. And the way that it rests in the hands of the people is that we elect people and we politically participate. And if we don't like the job that those in power are doing, well, then we have the right to elect new leaders, okay? Now, do keep in mind that the United States is a particular type of democracy. It is rule of the people. The political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. But the United States is not a direct democracy. It's what's known as a republic. The United States is a republic or a representative democracy. Now, you might hear some people say, well, the United States isn't really a democracy because it's a republic, and that is just not a true statement. What a republic is a representative form of democracy. It means that citizens have a regular opportunity to elect government officials, and they have a regular opportunity to participate in the political process through joining political parties, through campaigning, political activism, etc. Okay? And so the political authority ultimately does rest with the people because they're the ones who elect those who are doing the governing, and those representatives govern on the behalf of the people. Now, at the federal level, the United States is not a direct democracy. A direct democracy is where people are the ones who have direct control over the decisions that are made in a country. Okay, and some countries have that. They have national referendums. And they'll put it on the ballot, and they'll basically ask people, do you want to raise taxes, or do you want to institute paid family leave? You put the question directly to the people of that nation, and then what the people decide, they're the ones. Their decision is what drives that public policy. At the federal level, the United States is not a direct democracy. We're a representative democracy. However, we do, and we'll be talking about this later in the semester, we do have little tastes of direct democracy, right? At the state and the local level, where some states, they pass referendums that legalize marijuana, right? Wisconsin doesn't have a lot of opportunities for direct democracy. Usually they're just like referendums around school board issues. But at the federal level, we are not a direct democracy. We're a representative democracy. So the United States is a democracy, but it's a constitutional democracy. We have a constitutional form of government. And so next week, we're going to be learning about the United States Constitution, and we're going to be learning about the framers of the Constitution were really worried that power was going to be abused, right? They had a very realistic view of human nature, and they thought, if you give people power, they're likely to abuse it. So we better put a lot of basically guardrails in place, preventing people, particularly those who are in government, from abusing their power. And the way they did that was formalizing it in a document called the United States Constitution, which basically tells each branch of government the powers that it has, the powers that it doesn't have. And then, it basically, there are consequences for violating the United States Constitution and federal and state law. That citizens have to abide by the Constitution and federal and state law, but those in government have to as well. And so we're sort of, if you have government officials who don't like the outcome of an election, and then they're trying to override the constitutional authority that Congress has to certify votes, right? That's what happened on January 6th. That's unconstitutional. And as we see that there are consequences and will be consequences for violating the Constitution. Okay. And that's the way that it plays out in the constitutional government. There's a consequence for violating the rule of law. A more minor example is, when Bill Clinton was in office, that he used his veto pen to take budgets that the Congress had sent to his desk as president and just started crossing things out. He was governor of Arkansas, and governors oftentimes have the power of the veto on budget bills. They just start crossing out stuff that they don't want funded. And Bill Clinton tried to do that, and somebody called him on it. And one of the legislators from the state that he was line item vetoing certain aspects of the budget. And they said, you can't do that. The Constitution doesn't give the president that power, which it does not. And that, there was no criminal penalty for that. But that budgeting item was put back and given to the state because only the legislature has that budgeting authority. Okay. Constitutional governments also have protections for government, protect people from government trying to abuse its power. So the government must abide by the Constitution, but the people are protected from government trying to abuse their power. And so later in the semester, we're going to be learning about civil liberties, basically telling government what they can't do as it relates to your personal freedoms, and also civil rights. That's placing this obligation on government to not treat people unequally. Okay. And so that is sort of the broad outlines of what makes up a constitutional form of government. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is what is the difference between government and politics, because this is a class on both. So government is basically the institutions and procedures that rule over the people in that territory, okay? I oftentimes like to think about government as sort of like the skeleton, like the infrastructure of a society, right? The branches of government. Politics is different. So politics, I like thinking about politics as sort of like the energy that makes those institutions move, okay? The governmental institutions rule. And so your textbook defines politics as the conflict over the leadership, structure, and policies of government, okay? In other words, politics is the struggle to get power to influence who's leading us and the different types of policies that are going to be put in place, okay? And so we have these institutions, the legislature, the executive branch, the judiciary, but who serves in those is a product of politics. If you have a political party that is super popular, that people really identify with their values, then they're going to join that party, and then they're going to fight hard to elect people from that party. If you're in a party that doesn't have a lot of power, you're not going to be able to get those people elected, okay? And then people who vote have more political power than those who don't vote because they're participating in the process. So it's those who struggle for power, get out there and vote and elect people. They're the ones who really do have this authority over who's going to lead us and the types of policies that are going to be implemented. And we know, and we'll be learning throughout the course of this semester, that there are policies that are implemented, passed by the legislature and put into action, and others that are not. And they can have profound impacts on people's lives, both positively and negatively. And that is all a product of politics. Later in the semester, we're going to be learning about how you can engage in politics, and political participation is really the main way in which people exercise influence in democracy. Getting out to vote, joining political parties, campaigning for people, joining interest groups that advocate for particular perspectives. All of that, those are ways in which people engage in that struggle over who's going to lead us and what our policies of government are going to be. All right, that's it for lecture 1. In the next lecture, we're going to dig in more deeply into thinking about what makes a country a democratic country. We're going to be looking at the key components of democracy and what is needed for a healthy democracy to thrive. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.